The basement workspace beneath the 14th Naval District Administration building had become a nerve center of American naval intelligence by late April 1942. Joseph Rashford, a lieutenant commander who specialized in cryptanalysis, hadn't slept properly in weeks. The walls around him were lined with papers, intercepts, and decoded messages from Japanese naval communications. His wrinkled uniform and hollow eyes testified to the grinding pressure of his work, yet his mental faculties remained extraordinarily sharp. The patterns he was observing in enemy radio traffic suggested something monumental was being planned. The Pacific Fleet visible from his office window was barely a shadow of what it had been 6 months earlier. 4 battleships rested on the harbor floor. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. More than 2,000 American servicemen had perished on that December morning when Japanese forces had struck with devastating accuracy. But Rashford understood something crucial that the Japanese did not. America was not defeated. The nation was learning, adapting, reorganizing its defenses, and preparing to strike back with coordinated force. A cryptanalyst entered Rashford's workspace with another decoded intercept. The young officer looked exhausted from his endless hours wrestling with the enemy's naval cipher system. "Another message from the Japanese 4th Fleet, sir. They're asking for supply shipments for something designated Operation MI. Rashford's tired expression transformed instantly. For several weeks, his team had been tracking fragmented references to an enormous Japanese operation that would surpass even the scale of Pearl Harbor. Yet critical details remained mysterious. Where would it occur? When would it be launched? The designation, AF, appeared repeatedly throughout the intercepted messages, its meaning elusive and frustrating. If they could solve this puzzle, they might possess the information needed to reverse the entire trajectory of the war in the Pacific. At his headquarters overlooking the harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood observing salvage operations that were still attempting to raise sunken battleships from the sea floor. The Admiral, a white-haired Texan who had assumed command of the Pacific Fleet during its darkest period, had inherited a demoralized force that seemed outmatched by an enemy appearing unstoppable. His intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, approached nervously. "Admiral, the cryptanalysis section believes they have detected a significant pattern in Japanese communications." Layton reported that a major operation was being planned for early June. The scope and scale suggest it will be the largest Japanese operation since hostilities began. Nimitz turned from the window, his penetrating blue eyes fixed on Layton. Unlike many senior military officers who dismissed codebreaking as unreliable speculation, Nimitz had come to recognize that information represented the most powerful weapon available in contemporary warfare. Every decision he made could result in the survival or death of thousands of sailors and Marines. "How confident are they in this assessment?" Nimitz asked. "Rashford is willing to stake his professional reputation on it, sir." Layton responded with conviction. "His team believes the target is located somewhere in the Central Pacific region. They are working continuously to determine the precise location." The Admiral nodded slowly, considering the implications. If Rashford's analysis was accurate, this could represent the opportunity they desperately required. The Japanese had been advancing across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum, capturing territories methodically and establishing an empire extending from their home islands toward Australia. Yet every empire eventually encountered its limits, and perhaps the enemy was beginning to overextend themselves. The cryptanalysis center beneath Pearl Harbor operated with intense, almost frantic energy. Rashford's team labored with unwavering dedication in a basement space thick with cigarette smoke and the aroma of stale coffee. Mechanical IBM tabulating machines clattered continuously, processing thousands upon thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms bent over worksheets, searching methodically for patterns within the seemingly random characters. Wesley Ham Wright, one of Rashford's most capable cryptanalysts, suddenly announced a breakthrough. "I have found something significant." The Japanese keep referencing desalination equipment for AF. Why would they need special water processing systems for a major naval base? Rashford felt the pieces of the puzzle suddenly aligning. A location requiring additional water supplies, a place of significant strategic importance worthy of a massive operation. His mind rapidly considered the possibilities. The answer crystallized suddenly: Midway. That small American outpost guarding the approaches to Hawaii. One of his subordinates, Jasper Holmes, proposed an elegant solution to confirm their hypothesis. What if we have Midway deliberately transmit a message in plain language reporting water system failures? If the Japanese mention this in their coded traffic, we will have positive confirmation that AF refers to Midway. Rashford immediately ordered a secure communication line to be established to Leighton. Instruct Midway to send an unencrypted emergency report indicating their water distillation equipment is inoperable. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey lay in the ship's medical bay, his body weakened by a severe dermatitis condition. The aggressive commander, who had previously led carrier strike operations against Japanese-held territories, was now physically incapable of standing. His task force was preparing to sail into the most consequential battle of the entire war, yet he would not be commanding it personally. Admiral Raymond Spruance visited his ailing colleague in the medical bay. "Bill, you appear absolutely terrible," Spruance observed. The two men represented contrasting military temperaments. Halsey relied on boldness and instinctive decision-making, while Spruance approached warfare methodically and analytically. Yet they maintained profound mutual respect and shared an absolute commitment to defeating Japan. "Ray, I am transferring my command to you," Halsey stated weakly. "Take my sailors and strike those bastards with everything we possess. They have faith in you, and so do I." Spruance accepted the responsibility with grave acknowledgement. He had never previously commanded carriers in actual combat, but he possessed comprehensive understanding of naval warfare principles that few could match. Equally important, he possessed the capacity to listen carefully to his subordinates and make determinations founded on factual evidence rather than emotional impulses. These qualities would soon face unprecedented testing. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon inspected his assembled air force, which represented a mixed collection of aircraft. The small atoll's aviation units included obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, which had already demonstrated inferiority against the Japanese Zero, supplemented by a limited number of more modern Wildcat fighters and assorted bomber aircraft. His pilots consisted primarily of newly trained aviators with minimal combat experience. "Colonel, are we genuinely expected to defend against the Japanese Navy using these aircraft?" Major Lofton Henderson asked, gesturing toward the lined-up Buffaloes. The Marine pilot understood these planes carried the grim nickname of flying coffins among their operators. "We will stop them, or we will perish attempting," Shannon responded with grim determination. "Every moment we can delay them provides the Navy with additional opportunity to attack their carriers. That represents our mission, Major. We must use every available weapon." Back at Pearl Harbor, Rashford received confirmation that electrified his entire team. The Japanese had indeed reported in their encrypted messages that AF was experiencing water shortages. The target was definitively Midway. Armed with this critical intelligence, Nimitz convened an urgent meeting with his senior commanders. "Gentlemen, we have determined both their destination and approximate timing," Nimitz announced to the assembled officers. "The Japanese are deploying at least 4 carriers to strike Midway during early June. This presents our opportunity to ambush them. Captain Miles Browning, who had previously served as Halsey's chief of staff and would now work under Spruance, examined the intelligence documentation carefully. "Sir, our pilots are reporting possibly 6 operational Japanese carriers. If they commit all of them, the mathematics become unfavorable." Nimitz interrupted with composed assurance. "Our intelligence indicates they are dividing their forces. 2 carriers are being sent toward the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we will position our 3 carriers to intercept them." The mathematical calculation remained daunting nonetheless. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented battle-hardened vessels that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent Indian Ocean operations. Their pilots represented the world's most experienced air crews, having fought continuously for months. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, possessed crews with courage and determination, but their combat experience remained comparatively limited. Furthermore, Yorktown had sustained serious damage during the Battle of Coral Sea and was limping back toward Pearl Harbor. "How many days will be required to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked his maintenance officer. "Minimum 3 months, Admiral. She sustained bomb impacts that penetrated deep into her internal structure. The flight deck and fuel systems have sustained significant damage." "You have 3 days," Nimitz stated with absolute finality. "Whatever efforts prove necessary, I want that ship operational and ready to sail with the others." The maintenance officer's expression showed shock, yet he recognized the determination evident in Nimitz's demeanor. "Yes, sir. We will labor continuously." As May progressed toward June, Pearl Harbor transformed into a center of desperate activity. Approximately 1,400 workers swarmed across Yorktown's hull, welding, hammering, and installing replacement equipment. Repairs that should have required months were compressed into 72 hours of extraordinary human effort. Workers continued laboring until physical exhaustion forced them to stop, understanding that each weld, each rivet, each plate they installed could determine whether the coming battle would result in victory or defeat. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's most accomplished fighter pilots and tacticians, gathered his pilots aboard Yorktown. He had created innovative fighter tactics specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero's superior maneuverability, which had dominated every previous aerial engagement. "Listen carefully," Thatch addressed his young aviators. "The Zero can outturn us, climb faster than us, and possesses superior speed, but its construction is lighter and more fragile. Our Wildcats can absorb damage and remain operational. We will employ a new formation I have developed called the Thatch Weave. Maintain paired formations, provide mutual protection, and never engage a Zero in a one-on-one dogfight." Among the assembled pilots was Ensign George Gay, a young Texan who had recently graduated from flight school with barely 300 hours of accumulated flying experience. Gay attempted to conceal his apprehension as Thatch outlined their planned tactics against the Japanese fleet. The torpedo bombers would attack at low altitude and reduced speed, making them vulnerable targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. Everyone recognized this constituted essentially a suicide mission, yet none verbalized their concerns. Intelligence analysts worked ceaselessly attempting to assemble the complete Japanese order of battle. They understood that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had conceived and directed the Pearl Harbor attack, was personally commanding this operation. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the Japanese striking force at Pearl Harbor, would lead the carrier strike force. The intelligence assessments revealed overwhelming Japanese confidence. They were deploying to conclude what they had initiated 6 months previously. "They are committing massive resources to this operation," reported one of Nimitz's planning officers. "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports carrying invasion troops." They intend to seize Midway and establish it as a base for continued operations against Hawaii. "Let them come," Nimitz responded without emotion. "The larger their force, the greater their losses will be." On May 28, Task Force 16, which included Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance's command, departed Pearl Harbor. Cruisers and destroyers screened the carriers as their crews maintained battle readiness. 2 days later, on May 30th, Yorktown followed, her hull still displaying fresh welding and temporary repairs. The three carriers would meet northeast of Midway at a position designated Point Luck, perfectly positioned to ambush the approaching Japanese fleet. Aboard Enterprise, Spruance studied the most recent intelligence reports alongside his staff. The quiet admiral was renowned for his analytical abilities and methodical planning approach. Unlike Halsey's impulsive nature, Spruance examined every decision carefully, considering alternative possibilities before committing to a course of action. "The Japanese anticipate achieving surprise," Spruance explained to his staff. "They believe our carriers remain in the South Pacific or back at Pearl Harbor. That overconfidence represents our most significant advantage. We must exploit it with careful consideration." Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Enterprise's air group, prepared his pilots for the engagement ahead. A seasoned naval aviator, McCluskey understood both the capabilities and constraints of his aircraft and personnel. "When we locate their carriers, we attack with total commitment," McCluskey instructed his squadron commanders. "The dive bombers will strike from elevated altitude while the torpedo planes approach at sea level. Fighter protection will be minimal, so velocity and surprise become essential." Among McCluskey's pilots was Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, who commanded Bombing Squadron 6. Best had established a reputation for exceptional precision when executing dive bombing attacks, a capability that would prove critically important. He convened his own pilots for more detailed mission preparation. "Remember, our target is their carriers, not the battleships or cruisers," Best emphasized. "Regardless of how attractive other targets may appear, ignore them. We destroy their carriers, and we will win this war." As May transitioned into June, both fleets maneuvered toward their fateful confrontation. The Americans had achieved perfect positioning thanks to their code-breaking accomplishments, yet intelligence represented only one component of the equation. The approaching battle would be determined by pilot skill and courage, the decisions made by commanders operating under extreme pressure, and the razor-thin margins between success and catastrophe that characterized carrier warfare. On Midway itself, preparations intensified dramatically. Every available aircraft received ammunition and fuel. Marine personnel excavated defensive positions in the coral terrain. Radar operators maintained continuous surveillance of the skies, knowing that initial detection of approaching Japanese aircraft would come from their equipment. The garrison recognized they were vastly outnumbered, yet they understood their role precisely. Maintain defensive positions long enough for the Navy to attack the enemy carriers. Commander Cyril Simard, Midway's commanding officer, conducted a final inspection of the defensive installations. The atoll's 2 small islands contained ammunition stores, fuel tanks, and aircraft. A single well-positioned bomb could transform the entire base into an inferno. Yet no alternative existed. Everything depended on Midway surviving long enough for the carrier battle to be decided. As darkness enveloped June 3, 1942, American PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spread outward from Midway in extended search patterns. These slow, ungainly aircraft would provide the first contact with approaching enemy forces. The crews understood that locating the Japanese fleet would almost certainly result in their own deaths, as the lumbering patrol planes represented easy prey for Zero fighters. Nevertheless, finding the enemy justified any sacrifice. At 0900 on June 3rd, PBY pilot Jack Reed spotted ships on the horizon. "Enemy main body," he radioed, bearing 262 degrees, distance 700 miles. The Japanese invasion force had been discovered, but the carriers remained unlocated. That afternoon, 9 B-17 bombers from Midway attacked the invasion convoy, achieving no direct hits. 4 PBY aircraft equipped with torpedoes conducted a night assault, claiming one successful strike. Although these attacks caused minimal damage, they alerted the Japanese that the Americans were aware of their approach. At A300 on June 4th, general quarters sounded aboard the American carriers. In briefing rooms, pilots received final instructions and composed letters to their families. Mechanics performed final inspections on aircraft. Ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers carrying barely 230 aircraft were preparing to engage the Japanese Navy's most powerful striking force. The odds appeared impossible, yet the Americans possessed significant advantages. They knew when the enemy was coming. They knew where to locate them. Their commanders possessed the willingness to accept calculated risks. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the overall American operation from Yorktown, made a crucial tactical decision governing American strategy for the coming battle. Rather than maintaining his carriers in close formation for mutual defense, he chose to operate them separately, reducing the probability of all 3 being caught simultaneously. This gamble represented only one element of a massive gamble pervading the entire operation. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the circumstances were established for one of history's most consequential naval battles. The Japanese approached in supreme confidence, expecting to achieve tactical surprise. Instead, they were sailing directly into a carefully prepared trap. The American Navy, damaged but not defeated at Pearl Harbor, was about to demonstrate that American ingenuity and determination could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. At 0430 hours on June 4th, the pre-dawn darkness above Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers toward their target. The attacking force consisted of 36 torpedo bombers carrying conventional bombs for ground attack, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters providing fighter escort. As they organized their formation in the darkness, not a single Japanese aviator suspected that American carriers were positioned nearby, waiting for them. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 0552. Large aircraft formation bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, the operator reported, maintaining composure despite his racing pulse. Air raid sirens wailed across the small atoll. Marines sprinted to defensive positions while pilots raced toward their aircraft. Every available aircraft on Midway required immediate takeoff or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky, including his obsolete Buffalo fighters, comprehending they were flying toward probable annihilation. The Buffalo possessed inferior speed, maneuverability, and firepower compared to the Zero. Yet Henderson's Marines possessed unwavering commitment to defend their base regardless of the consequences. Enemy fighters at 12 o'clock high, radio transmissions crackled with warnings as the Marines encountered the incoming strike force. The Zeros attacked the American fighters with predatory efficiency. Within moments, the sky filled with burning American aircraft descending toward the ocean. Henderson's aircraft was among those shot down as he led his squadron's dive bombers in their assault. However, the Marine sacrifice achieved important results. Their attack disrupted the Japanese formation and forced the bombers to execute evasive maneuvers. Critically, it provided additional time for Midway's bomber force to depart the island and proceed toward the Japanese fleet, whose location had been reported by searching PBY patrol planes. At 0630, Tomonaga's force reached Midway and initiated their attack. Bombs descended on the airfield, fuel tanks, and defensive positions. Midway's anti-aircraft guns blazed continuously, filling the atmosphere with black smoke clouds. A direct hit on the power facility eliminated Midway's radar capability. Another bomb ignited the fuel tanks, sending thick smoke columns into the sky. Yet as Tomonaga circled to evaluate the damage, he recognized that the attack had failed in its primary objective. The runways were damaged but repairable. Numerous defensive positions remained functional. Most significantly, they had destroyed very few aircraft on the ground because the Americans had successfully launched them earlier. Tomonaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. "A second attack wave is necessary." This communication would trigger a sequence of decisions determining the battle's outcome. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo confronted a critical dilemma. He had retained 93 aircraft equipped with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. Should he convert them to ground attack weapons for another Midway strike or maintain them prepared for naval targets? At 0715, Nagumo made his fateful decision: rearm the aircraft with bombs for land attack. Crews immediately commenced the dangerous process of removing torpedoes and installing conventional bombs. This dangerous work proceeded on crowded hangar decks, where armed ordnance was being transported amid volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Unbeknownst to Nagumo, 200 miles to the northeast, American carriers were already launching their strikes. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, had made the crucial decision to launch all available aircraft at maximum range. This calculated risk meant his planes would possess barely sufficient fuel for return, yet it would encounter the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment. "Pilots, man your aircraft," the order echoed across the American flight decks. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, understanding the desperate odds confronting his slow, vulnerable Douglas TBD Devastators. During his ready room briefing, he had spoken with brutal honesty to his pilots. "If we exhaust our fuel, we will ditch together. If only one of us survives, he will strike a carrier. May God watch over us all." Among Waldron's pilots was Ensign George Gay, the young Texan who would become the sole survivor of his entire squadron. As Gay climbed into his Devastator, he verified his rear gunner's position. Radio operator Bob Huntington provided a thumbs up, attempting to disguise his apprehension through false confidence. By 0800, the American strike had launched, though the squadrons became separated in cloud cover, each proceeding independently toward the anticipated Japanese location. This coordination failure would paradoxically prove both disadvantageous and ultimately beneficial in the coming engagement. Meanwhile, Nagumo's difficulties were multiplying. At 0728, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported, "Enemy surface ships sighted bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. The pilot had failed to identify the ship classifications, a critical omission that left Nagumo uncertain whether he confronted carriers or simply surface vessels. "Suspend rearming operations," Nagumo commanded. Yet chaos reigned on the Japanese hangar decks. Some aircraft were completely rearmed, others were partially converted, and ordnance was scattered everywhere in the confusion. The delay proved catastrophic. At 0820, the Tone Scout plane transmitted another report that shocked Nagumo. Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The Americans possessed operational carriers, and his own aircraft were caught in various states of reconfiguration. Worse, his first strike wave was returning from Midway, desperately low on fuel and requiring immediate landing. The first American attacks originated from Midway-based aircraft, Marine dive bombers, and Army B-17s attacking from high altitude. These uncoordinated assaults scored no direct hits, and the Japanese carriers evaded the descending bombs with ease. Zero fighters slaughtered the Marine aircraft, yet each failed attack forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver, delaying flight operations critically. At 0920, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet through scattered clouds. His torpedo squadron was alone, having become separated from the fighters and dive bombers. Waldron comprehended that attacking without fighter protection constituted suicide, yet he also recognized this might represent their only opportunity. Attack immediately, Waldron commanded, leading his 15 Devastators down toward the Japanese carriers at wave-top altitude. The Zeros waited. As the slow torpedo bombers lumbered toward their targets at sea level, Japanese fighters attacked with devastating ferocity. One by one, the Devastators ignited and fell into the sea. Ensign Gay observed his squadron mates perishing around him. Waldron's plane was struck and cartwheeled into the ocean. Others exploded in mid-air or fragmented under concentrated fire. Gay pressed forward, his gunner Huntington firing desperately at the swarming Zeros until cannon fire killed him. Gay released his torpedo at the carrier Soryu, then flew directly over the ship so low that he could distinguish Japanese sailors' faces. Moments later, his aircraft sustained multiple bullet wounds and crashed into the sea. Wounded but surviving, Gay inflated his life jacket and concealed himself beneath a floating seat cushion, becoming an unwilling observer of the battle's conclusion. Torpedo Squadron 8 was annihilated. All 15 Devastators were destroyed. Of 30 men, only George Gay lived. Their torpedoes, plagued by mechanical defects, either missed or failed to detonate, yet their sacrifice was not meaningless. The attack had pulled Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving higher altitudes undefended. Additional American torpedo squadrons arrived and experienced similar catastrophes. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. The obsolete Devastators and their defective torpedoes seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. Yet the repeated attacks forced constant evasive maneuvers, preventing Nagumo from launching or recovering aircraft. By 10:20, the Japanese carriers existed in complete chaos. Returning aircraft from the Midway strike orbited overhead, desperately low on fuel. The flight decks were congested with aircraft undergoing refueling and rearming. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered on the hangar decks. Fire safety procedures were abandoned in the rush to prepare a strike against the American carriers. This moment of maximum vulnerability coincided with Commander Wade McCluskey's arrival overhead with 33 dive bombers from Enterprise. McCluskey had directed his squadrons on an exhausting search, flying past the point where fuel reserves permitted safe return. Just as he prepared to reverse course, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast, correctly deducing it was heading to rejoin the main force. McCluskey followed its trajectory. At 1:22, McCluskey's perseverance received its reward. Through breaks in the clouds, he observed the Japanese carriers spread below, their flight decks crowded with aircraft. No Zeros contested him at altitude. They were all at sea level, eliminating the last torpedo bombers. McCluskey divided his force, assigning squadrons to different targets, and transmitted the order millions of Americans had anticipated since Pearl Harbor. Attack immediately. Lieutenant Dick Best led his squadron toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. As he pushed over into his dive, Best concentrated on the expanding shape of the carrier. At 2,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and executed a sharp pullout. Behind him, his wingman followed in precise sequence. Most bombs missed. The pilots were exhausted and diving through anti-aircraft fire, yet Best's bomb was perfectly placed. It penetrated Akagi's flight deck and detonated in the hangar deck among fueled and armed aircraft. The result was catastrophic. Secondary explosions cascaded through the ship as fuel and ordnance detonated in chain reactions. Within minutes, Akagi was an inferno. Simultaneously, Kaga sustained at least 4 bomb impacts from McCluskey's other squadron. The hits initiated uncontrollable fires among the packed aircraft. Nearly simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown scored 3 direct hits on Soryu in a textbook attack. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's premier carriers were burning wrecks. From his hiding place in the water, Ensign Gay observed the Japanese carriers detonating. The ships that had seemed so invincible moments before were now burning funeral pyres. He could see Japanese sailors abandoning ship, leaping into the oil-covered ocean to escape the flames. His squadron mates' bodies floated nearby, yet their sacrifice had created this moment. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from burning Akagi to a cruiser, experienced profound shock. 3/4 of his striking power had been eliminated in minutes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were finished. Only Hiryu remained operational, racing northwest to escape while launching a counterstrike. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, constructed through 6 months of victories, had been shattered. Yet the battle remained unfinished. Hiryu's counterstrike discovered Yorktown early that afternoon. Despite determined defense by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, Japanese dive bombers scored 3 hits that left the American carrier burning and tilting. Damage control parties fought desperately to preserve the ship, and their efforts appeared successful until a second strike by torpedo bombers inserted 2 additional torpedoes into Yorktown's hull. Admiral Fletcher transferred to a cruiser, passing tactical command to Spruance. Yorktown's crew abandoned ship, yet the resilient carrier refused to sink. She would remain afloat until June 7th, when Japanese submarine I-168 discovered her and delivered the final torpedo hits that sent her to the bottom. Yorktown's loss was painful, yet by then Hiryu had joined her sisters in destruction. Late on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise discovered the last Japanese carrier and left her burning from bow to stern. 4 Japanese carriers, the core of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now rested on the Pacific sea floor. As darkness descended on June 4th, American pilots returned to their carriers with barely fumes remaining in their tanks. Many damaged aircraft or fuel exhausted planes ditched in the darkening sea. Destroyers raced to rescue pilots from the water. The human cost was substantial, yet the strategic victory was complete. Admiral Spruance, cautious and calculating, resisted pursuing the retreating Japanese. He recognized Yamamoto's battleships were somewhere in the darkness, and his pilots were exhausted. Preserving his victory seemed preferable to risking his carriers in a night engagement where battleship guns might prove decisive. This controversial decision proved correct. As June 5th dawned, American search planes discovered only burning hulks and scattered survivors where the Japanese fleet had been. The few remaining Japanese aircraft launched from cruisers and the crippled carriers before they sank, executed desperate attacks but achieved nothing. Over the following 2 days, American forces continued attacking the retreating Japanese, sinking the heavy cruiser Mikuma and damaging other vessels. The statistics were staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,500 men, including numerous experienced pilots. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 1 T-7 aircraft, and 37 aircraft, and 36 men, yet numbers represented only partial truth. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been permanently destroyed. The initiative had transferred to the Americans. In the aftermath, both sides attempted understanding what had occurred. For the Americans, the victory confirmed their faith in intelligence and calculated risk-taking. Nimitz's decision trusting his codebreakers, Spruance's careful tactical decisions, and the extraordinary courage of the pilots had combined to achieve what seemed impossible. For the Japanese, Midway revealed fundamental flaws in their planning and doctrine. The assumption of superiority, the complex operational plan dispersing their forces, the failure to adequately scout for American carriers, and the crucial minutes of vulnerability during the rearming process had all contributed to disaster. Perhaps most significantly, the sacrifice of the American torpedo bomber crews had created the conditions for victory by disrupting Japanese operations and pulling down the fighter cover. Men like John Waldron and his squadron had comprehended they were flying to almost certain death, yet they pressed their attacks regardless. As news of the victory spread, America erupted in celebration. After 6 months of defeats and retreats, the United States had achieved its first major victory against Japan. The path to Tokyo would be long and bloody, yet Midway proved it could be traveled. The Japanese Navy, seemingly invincible since Pearl Harbor, had been decisively defeated by a smaller American force. In Japan, the government concealed the defeat's extent from the public. Returning sailors were isolated, preventing word from spreading. The official account claimed great victory, yet the Navy understood the truth. Japan's offensive phase was finished. From this point forward, they would assume the defensive, attempting to retain conquered territories against an increasingly powerful American counteroffensive. The Battle of Midway became a turning point not merely in the Pacific War, but in world history. It demonstrated that intelligence, properly applied, could overcome numerical disadvantage. It revealed that courage and sacrifice, even in apparent failure, could create opportunities for victory. Most importantly, it proved that the United States possessed the will and capability to defeat even the most formidable enemy. Admiral Nimitz, in his after-action report, credited the codebreakers who had uncovered the Japanese plan, the commanders who made crucial decisions under pressure, and above all, the pilots who pressed their attacks against overwhelming odds. Yet he also recognized war's role of chance. Had the American dive bombers arrived 5 minutes later, after the Japanese had launched their strikes, the outcome might have been very different. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Midway. The 4 carriers lost represented years of construction and decades of pilot training that could not be replaced. While Japan would commission new carriers, they would never again possess the combination of ships, aircraft, and experienced air crews that had made their early victories possible. For the young American pilots who survived, Midway represented a defining moment. Men like Dick Best, who had placed the bomb dooming Akagi, would continue flying throughout the war. Yet nothing would match the intensity of those few minutes over the Japanese fleet. Others, like Ensign Gay, would carry memories of fallen comrades for their remaining lives. The battle also marked a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time, a major naval engagement had been fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. The battleship era was ending. The aircraft carrier was now the dominant naval weapon. In the broader World War II context, Midway was America's Stalingrad, the point where a seemingly unstoppable advance was not merely halted, but reversed. Combined with the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal that would follow, it marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. America's mobilized industrial might would produce ships and aircraft in quantities Japan could never match. The Midway veterans would subsequently fight in the Solomons, the Philippines, and eventually approaching Japan itself. They had learned that the Japanese could be defeated, that American training and equipment, properly employed, were more than a match for enemy skill and determination. For Japan, Midway revealed the fatal strategic flaw. They had initiated a war against an enemy possessing 10 times their industrial capacity, believing that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans had demonstrated at Midway that they possessed both material strength and the will to employ it. The codebreakers who had made victory possible received minimal public recognition during the war. Their work remained classified for decades. Yet officers like Rashford and his team had arguably achieved the most important intelligence victory in American history. By solving the AF puzzle and predicting Japanese movements, they had given Nimitz the information necessary to position his forces perfectly. Lieutenant Commander Rashford, despite his crucial role, would be reassigned shortly after Midway due to bureaucratic conflicts with Washington. His team's success had proven that intelligence could win battles, yet inter-service rivalries prevented proper recognition until decades later. In 1986, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. As years passed, Midway assumed almost mythical status in American military history. It became the textbook example of how intelligence, courage, and tactical excellence could combine to achieve victory against superior forces. Military academies worldwide studied the battle, seeking understanding of how the Americans had achieved such complete reversal of fortune. The human dimension of Midway should never be forgotten. Behind strategic movements and tactical decisions were individual acts of heroism determining the outcome. The Marine pilots flying obsolete fighters against Zeros, the torpedo bomber crews pressing their attacks without fighter protection, the dive bomber pilots searching past the point of safe return, the damage control parties saving ships. All contributed to victory. Midway proved that democracies could fight and win against totalitarian enemies. The American carriers were crewed by citizen sailors, many of whom had been civilians months before. They faced an enemy with years of combat experience and the tradition of victory. Yet when the moment arrived, these Americans performed with skill and courage, matching anything in their nation's history. The Midway lesson resonates beyond its historical moment. It reminds us that apparent weakness can be transformed to strength through intelligence and determination. That sacrifice, even in failure, can create opportunities for others. That technological superiority means nothing without the will to employ it effectively. That free nations, when threatened, can summon the courage to defend themselves against any odds. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the Pacific War's tide had turned decisively. The Japanese would fight on with characteristic determination for 3 additional years, yet the outcome was no longer uncertain. At Midway, a smaller American force had destroyed the heart of Japanese naval power and seized the initiative. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war prediction proved prophetic. He had warned that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that he possessed no confidence. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The architect of Japan's early victories had comprehended that once America recovered and mobilized its strength, Japan's defeat was inevitable. At Midway, that inevitability became reality, written in the burning hulks of 4 aircraft carriers and the sacrifice of brave men who fought and died for their nations in the vast Pacific sky.